One of the reasons violence in Iraq has subsided so dramatically was a significant battle that U.S. forces won in Sadr City just 5 months ago. Sadr City, part of Baghdad, is home to 2 million Shia and turf of the fiercely anti-American cleric Muqtada al-Sadr. For years, insurgents in Iraq have been stymieing U.S. troops with homemade low-tech weapons like car bombs and improvised roadside explosives. But in the Battle of Sadr City, as we learned in a high-level debriefing with the U.S. commander in Iraq, the Americans overpowered the Shiite militias with high-tech, the most advanced, sophisticated, whiz-bang hardware and software on Earth. Electronics, lasers, high-resolution cameras that can literally cut through the fog of war. When we were in Iraq to interview the new commanding general, Ray Odierno, we went with him as he surveyed the former battlefield, through neighborhoods now pacified, and into a market returning to life. At his side was the brigade commander who led the battle here, Colonel John Hort.
This was some of the heaviest fighting that we had experienced during our 2 months in Sadr City.
Right where we're standing.
Right where we're standing.
And standing there, or any place in Sadr City, could not have been done just 5 months ago. This was off limits to Americans. For years, the fiery cleric Muqtada al-Sadr and his Shiite militia control the streets. Last March, they began using the neighborhood as a launching pad to lob rockets into the nearby Green Zone, the seat of the Iraqi government and site of the U.S. Embassy.
Not just 1 or 2, but we're talking 20 to 30 rocket attacks coming out of Sadr City.
Colonel Hort gave General Odierno his first briefing on the battle, and we were invited to sit in. It's rare that reporters can videotape sessions like this one. We were asked to turn our cameras off only once, and were allowed to broadcast only a few slides that were later declassified for us, like this one.
And you can kind of see some of the locations they were coming out of throughout all of Sadr City against the Green Zone.
The U.S. military had wanted to mount an attack, but Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki balked for a year because the militias are Shiites like him, and that made a decision to fight them politically risky. But you waited for him.
It was his decision.
To give you his decision to give you the go.
I think what he finally realized were that the militias that had safe havens in Sadr City were really trying to destabilize the government of Iraq. And he realized that it would add instability to his own government.
Once Maliki gave the go-ahead, a U.S. Stryker battalion went in, but they confronted a steady stream of militia reinforcements.
I mean, every day it was 20, 30, 40 new guys that were coming down to fight.
So Hort and his men had to do something to keep them out. They decided to build a wall, a barrier straight across Sadr City. It would also create a buffer zone wide enough to prevent the militia rockets from reaching the Green Zone. To build the wall, Colonel Hort's Charlie Company began putting up massive T-shaped concrete slabs. Fighting erupted almost immediately as sniper fire came in from every direction. Charlie Company retaliated with massive tank fire.
We fired 800 tank rounds in this fight. We haven't fired that many tank rounds since the start of the war.
Colonel Hort said the building of the so-called T-wall became a magnet for every bad guy in Sadr City. This was one of the most intense engagements in the entire war. Yet even as the battle raged, the wall went up.
It was literally concrete barrier by concrete barrier. We just wasn't going out there putting up some barriers. I mean, it was a fight every inch of the way.
Put them up under fire?
Guys would climb the ladders to unhook the crane chains from the wall, unarmed, while people are firing at them. So it was high venture.
Lieutenant Colonel Brian Eifler's team laid down cover fire, while some soldiers, wide open and exposed, unhooked the chains from the crane. On days when the shooting was particularly fierce, they were able to put up only 8 slabs.
Every time I tried to use against us up at the wall, I mean, it was step by step by step, and fighting literally every hour of the day.
They called in sniper teams from the elite Navy SEALs and air support, F-18 fighter jets and Apache helicopters that protected the flanks. But here's what really made the difference: an arsenal of advanced, high-flying technology, UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles with highly improved camera systems so sensitive they can see the enemy, even at night, through clouds and gun smoke from high up. They can spot someone smoking or a weapon on someone's side, and they have sensors so advanced they can hear enemy radio transmissions and pinpoint their location.
In 2003, we didn't have all the systems that are now available. We had some, but we didn't have all the UAVs.
In the battle for Sadr City, they used two different UAVs. One was the Shadow drone, depicted here on one of Colonel Hort's slides. 20 or 30 seconds after a militia team fired a rocket, the Shadow locked on them, shadowed them, watched them move, and set up for their next shot. The Predator was activated. These are actual pictures of the battle on the streets of Sadr City. As you can see, a group of militia fighters rushed to a car that had just been hit by a U.S. Hellfire missile. They remove a mortar tube from the trunk and load it into a second car, which they drive through the streets to an open field. At that point, the Predator locks its sight onto the vehicle and fires off another missile. According to the Army, this killed 2 fighters inside the car and destroyed the mortar tube. War by remote control. This is how Charlie Company hunted down the militia rocket teams and whittled down their numbers.
You know, they went from 20 to 30-man groups down to 5, 4, and in some cases only 1 or 2. The Predator and the Shadow were just phenomenal in their ability to see the enemy, particularly after he shot a rocket.
We have learned from other sources that Colonel Hort's ground troops were supported by a secret special ops unit called Task Force 17. Using their own Predators, along with Iraqi undercover operatives and eavesdropping, it was able to take out some of the militia leaders who were based north of the wall, hiding among the civilian population. With the help of the drones and their high-powered cameras, Army commanders were able to see or map the entire theater of operations and figure out the enemy's tactics and patterns with so-called persistent surveillance.
And in some cases, we would wait 4, 6, even 10 hours to do the engagement because we wanted to go after the whole group, the company chain of command, as you want to call it that, where they would actually pick up the rail, drive in their vehicle, go to another location, and do an after-action review on what they did.
In other words, after a long skirmish, all the individual militia rocket teams would group with their leaders. In this video, you can see how Colonel Hort's men would be tracking as the militia fighters went to a set location for a battle assessment and their new assignments.
So once they got to that site, that's when we would do the engagement. Sometimes that took 6, 8, 10 hours to wait, and that's what Predator allowed us to do. It truly preyed on the enemy.
Can I ask that they had no idea? How far
The Predator's flies about 10,000 feet.
Yes, sir.
It's a UAV.
And no noise.
It's so high up they can't
hear it?
Sometimes they can, but it's pretty hard. It's very difficult.
Can't hear any. This was the first time UAVs were used this way at the brigade level, allowing soldiers on the ground to manage and synchronize the information themselves. They call it find, fix, and finish.
All of this was pushed down to the brigade commander and used in this fight, and primarily focused north against the rocket teams.
Colonel Hort and his men were able to watch in real time as the enemy planted over 300 armor-piercing roadside bombs, or IEDs. And so they made the decision early in the battle to use tanks and Bradleys fortified with thick reactive tiles. They were so effective, said Colonel Hort, that even while they actually struck 120 IEDs, the crews were all protected.
It went from literally 60 attacks down to 3 or 4 attacks. And that was because
a day, a week, or
60 attacks a day.
So the Battle of Sadr City was won with a combination of high-tech and no-tech, lasers and electronic eyes in the sky, and cement. Over the course of the fighting that lasted 8 weeks, the number of U.S. troops grew from 700 to 2,000, up against roughly 4,000. An estimated 700 of the militia fighters were killed. 6 Americans died. Near the end, in May, Colonel Hort says as many as 40 of the militia leaders fled, and a ceasefire was negotiated.